But tonight we are doing some crying. We will be unearthing memories through writing, using images and visual poetry to tell stories, finding humor and healing through hard feelings, and hopefully having some good cathartic cries. So I'm excited to do that with all of you. And the first thing to get us started is a little opening lines, which you will have some time to respond to, and then we can share back in the chat, or you can share, come off mute and share in the Zoom. The opening lines are, we often think of crying as something done in isolation, but sadness, grief, and even the joy that brings us to tears are opportunities to connect more deeply with the people around us. So we'd like you to respond to the question, who do you cry with? And we hope to get to connect with you all on that. We'll play some music and write for a little while. So, of course, we have Pepita Sandwich here today. And Pepita is an Argentine illustrator and visual artist born in Buenos Aires and trained in Vermont at the Center for Cartoon Studies. And she currently resides in New York City. In 2013, she began publishing webcomics and drawings of relatable life observations with a focus on feelings, friendship, and self-discovery. Since then, her work has won over a fast-growing international audience. Pepita creates visual essays for media outlets like The Washington Post, Vogue, Los Angeles Times, and The New Yorker. And her most recent book, which we're here for tonight, The Art of Crying, The Healing Power of Tears, was published by Voracious. Her previous books were published by Penguin Random House in Spain and Argentina. They are Diario de Supervivencia, which is the Survival Diaries, that was published in 2016, and Las Mujeres Mueven Montañas, which is Women Move Mountains, published in 2019. In 2021, she launched her online course with the global learning platform Domestika, where she teaches diary comics and storytelling. And we are lucky enough to get a little bit of her insight tonight. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Pepita to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much everyone for being here. I love being in this space and everything that you shared. I can relate to a lot of the, things that you wrote, especially with me being such a serial crier. I identify with crying when other people are crying. And it's curious because we have this very mysterious thing in our brain, which are called mirror neurons. And it's something that, connects us with others. So whenever we see people sad or crying, we kind of get the same feeling ourselves. So I think that is our great power as human beings, to be able to feel and to connect with strangers and people that are suffering in a way. And I think we've been taught not to feel our emotions that much, especially during the last few centuries. And it's great that now we are kind of like trying to connect more with our mental health and our mental powers. I also really love the cat experience. Whenever you feel sad, your cat kind of like perceives that, and they come to you. And I used to have a cat, and I felt the same way. And once my grandmother passed away, and my cat would like lick my tears, and it was really healing. So I can definitely feel that connection too with the animal world. And we are the only ones, humans, it is said that we are the only species that cry because of emotions. Other animals cry, but it's not usually emotional tears. The component of their tears is not the same. But I do feel like cats or dogs or other animals can really feel our emotions. So I definitely relate to that. But thank you so much for being here this afternoon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey first, and then I'm going to read from my latest book. But as Kina said, I'm from Argentina. I grew up in Buenos Aires, and I had a pretty, intense but fun childhood. I grew up with 4 brothers, and my mom was an art historian, so there was a lot of arts around my house. and my grandmother used to write children's books. So I had a lot of, influences from these women in my life. But when, you grew up in South America, you have all these different influences from around the world. And sometimes, things came from the US, and like movies or television shows or even characters, they were kind of like mixed with this South American, imprint. So I think a lot of my inspirations come from pop culture, but with a mix of my South American nostalgia and, all the feelings of growing up in a different part of the world. So I think that's part of my creative DNA. I would say that a lot of my work has to do with nostalgia and feeling like I want to grab this, sentiment, this feeling from my childhood and bring it back to the present times. And that's why this salon is called How to Touch a Memory, because I feel like if we really focus and we try to grab that feeling or that emotion from a past moment, we can bring it back and also create a hopeful future. So I think that past, present, and future are connected through writing and through drawing. So yeah, that's my work has a lot to do with time travel and grabbing kind of like a very special but also hard to describe feeling, and trying my best to connect with people through um you know another time and a personal experience. So what I do is a lot of visual essays that start from my own personal experience, but I try to make them universal, and I try to think that my own personal experience can also help other people, but also help myself to not feel so alone. So I feel like comics and graphic novels are a great, powerful tool to connect with a lot of people around the world, because you not only have the written part and the words, but also you can add a new layer of metaphor and you can expand the words with a visual element. So when I finished high school in Argentina, I didn't know I could really work and live as an illustrator and graphic novelist. I didn't have anyone around me that was doing a job as a cartoonist, so I couldn't see myself doing that. So when I finished high school, I went to design school, and I think I also had a pressure of doing things right. And because my mom was an art historian and she took me to museums a lot, I thought that to be an artist, you had to have all this like very realistic style with like shadows and perspective. And I didn't have that. So I didn't let myself be an illustrator because I already had this limiting belief that I couldn't do that. So I went to design school, and there I did textile design. So I studied to be a textile designer. And when I finished my undergrad, I realized that I didn't want to work in fashion or, that world. So I applied for scholarship in Italy, and I won that scholarship, and it was for photography school. And at the time I was taking a lot of photos. So I knew I wanted to do something visual, but I couldn't find my journey. And I always say that the illustration career kind of found me, because when I moved to Italy, I realized that at the same school where I was doing photography, there was an illustration career path. So I sneaked into a lot of the classes, and I met people that were doing that and pursuing that. And suddenly this whole world opened, and I realized that I could work as an illustrator and comic artist. But it took me a while. It was not a linear, it's not like I finished school and I knew what to do. I had to go through all these steps and all these mistakes, quote unquote. They were not mistakes because I learned from them, but I had to turn, my my steering wheel a few times to find what I wanted to do. And finally, when I found it, it was like such a big relief and such a nice moment because, you know, even though it's hard to work as an illustrator and a comic artist, it was my passion. It is my passion and what I wanted to do. So when I found it, I felt like I found my right shoe, like the shoe that went into my feet and I felt comfortable. So I started doing a lot of illustrations for myself first. So I had a sketchbook. I always take a sketchbook with me, and I always have a sketchbook in my book in my bag. So I'm drawing all the time. And at the time, I was drawing my everyday life. I was drawing up from observation. So a lot of things that happened to me that, you know, in a particular day or someone I met. So I was kind of like drawing and writing everything that would happen to me. And at the time I was living abroad and I was writing down everything, like even whatever I bought that day, like at the grocery store, I would write down instead of like writing my expenses, I would draw them. And I went back to Argentina at the time because I felt like I needed to go back to my home country and kind of like regroup and see what I wanted to do. So I went back there, and at the time it was 2011, so Instagram and social media was just starting. It was very different from what it is right now, but I kind of like decided that I wanted to do a challenge for myself, and that was drawing and writing one comic panel a day and posting that into social media. And at the time, I had a day job that was not related to what I wanted to do, but I was trying to pursue that. And because social media was kind of starting, it was a very fresh ground for illustrators to start sharing this very relatable um, one panel comics. So I think a lot of, you know, people started feeling related to my drawings and started sharing them online. And I also had a Tumblr website. So I was sharing my drawings and my comics on Tumblr at the time. And that's how I started doing web comics. And that was more like, as I said, like more observational humor and a lot of everyday life dialogues with my friends, my partner. So it was very, very based on real life, but with a twist of humor to it. And I started getting some jobs because I think because I like forced myself to do one drawing a day and post it online, some people started like seeing this you know work that I was doing, and they started hiring me for that kind of work. So that's why I think it's nice whenever you want to do something to just do whatever you know you want to create as a job for yourself when you're starting, just sharing the kind of job you want to do, especially in illustration, having a portfolio or something online where you show what you really want to do. I think that's a great advice that someone gave me, just like do the work that you want to be hired for. So I was doing this, and I started working for a few magazines in Argentina. And my editor back then reached out, and she wanted to do a compilation of my comics for my first book called Survival Diaries. And my first book is mostly just vignettes, so it's just like pages with one page, one panel comics about being a millennial in the 2010s and just trying to get jobs and trying to navigate this world and navigate adulthood. So it was very much a product of my time on the internet. And I finished that book, and then I decided I wanted to do longer stories. So at the time, I didn't really know how to write scripts. I wrote scripts, but very short scripts for my one panel comics, but I wanted to write longer stories. So I decided that I wanted to pursue a master's degree in comics. And I found this small school in Vermont, which was very far away from Buenos Aires. But I decided to apply for a scholarship again. I'm always like applying to things and trying to find a way, you know, trying to see what's my next step in my career, trying to find ways of kind of like getting there. So I applied to the school and I got in. And in 2017, I moved from Buenos Aires, which is a big city like New York City or even bigger. And I moved to a very small town in the middle of nowhere. So this was a very big change for me. And it was my first time in Vermont when I moved there. And I remember the first day I got there, it was kind of like a Sunday afternoon and everything was closed. And I was like, what did I do? But I kept writing and drawing. And I think drawing and writing for me is such a special tool for meditation and also for kind of like a grounding tool. Whenever I feel anxious, I know that I can kind of like draw some things, draw my feelings, just sit down with my sketchbook and do something with my hand and feel very connected to my hand and kind of like slow down. So I felt better after drawing a little bit. And those 2 years in Vermont were great because I was surrounded by cartoonists and we were all drawing and writing every day. There's not a lot to do, in terms of like going to the movies or museums. There's not a lot to do. So we were just inside writing and drawing. And we would go outside and the nature obviously is beautiful and you feel very calm. So I think it was great for me to just spend a few years there, intensely doing things very intensively and writing and drawing as much as I could. And then there in Vermont, one day I went to this mountain called Mount Washington, and I climbed the mountain with some friends. And when I got to the top of the mountain, there was a little museum, and I found the story of 42-year-old mountaineer called Annie Smith Peck that had climbed her first mountain when she was 42, and then kept, kept going and doing this, going up hills and mountains throughout her life. And she did all those, 7 highest mountains in the world. She climbed them and she died when she was around in her 80s. But she kept climbing during all her life. But she had changed careers when she was 42. And a lot of people at the time, because this was around the first part of the 20th century, a lot of people didn't think women should climb mountains. They thought, a lot of people told her like you should stay at home and like not doing all these adventures. So she really broke all these, rules of patriarchy, and she was a really inspiration for a lot of people. And she would climb mountains with a sign that said votes for women. So this was the time where they were there was a lot of activism and a lot of marches for actually getting the law for women to be able to vote. So she was a pioneer in that sense too, a very social compromised person. And when I read this story, I was suddenly like so inspired by, these women that changed careers, that really kind of like broke all the rules and was doing what she loved. And I decided to write a nonfiction comic about her. And it was an 8-page comic. And I decided I wanted to write this comic as a letter from herself to the future. So I kind of like researched all her life. And then once I knew all these facts and all these things that she did, I kind of like embodied her character and I wrote through her perspective. So it was written in the first person as a letter for the future with all the things that she did. So I wanted to like inspire people that would read this, but from her perspective. So once I finished that story, that the Annie Smith Beck, I made a mini comic for that, and then I kind of wanted to keep writing more about these inspiring stories, and I felt a lot of inspiration in real stories. And I proposed this idea to my publisher about doing a book of women that would like do break some rules and do some adventures around the world. And I wanted to pick people from different countries, different continents, different social backgrounds. So I kind of like had a list of 40 women, and I started reading about them, and then I picked 14, and I wanted it to be very diverse. So I think I picked the most diverse stories. And this was kind of like 2018 when I did this book. So at the time, some books were coming out from like women doing things and all this compilation of very inspirational stories of women like doing things. And this was like right after Me Too, the Me Too movement. And in Argentina, we had a movement in 2015 called Ni Una Menos, which is no women less. No women less, I would say. It's like a feminist movement, which I was part of, that we were trying to shine a light into this, violence against women, and also the right of legal and safe abortion in Argentina. So that's why the cover of the book feels like a march, and all the different women are kind of like holding signs, and that's the title, because at the time that was like what was happening. We were marching, we were outside in the street and doing all this, we were trying to raise awareness on these topics. But what I wanted my book to do differently is that I wanted to write from the first person. So all the stories are written as if I was them, and like letters to the future. So I really researched all their stories. I read a lot about them. And then once I had to sit down and write the comic for each one, I would kind of like felt this force that was kind of like coming into my body. It was kind of like a mystical experience every time I would write a song for them. Sorry, a song. I wrote a song for each one. That's why I get confused. But whenever I had to write the comic for each one, I I felt this kind of like, I felt them coming into my mind. And some of them were from, far back, and they were already dead. Some of them are still alive. And yeah, I just wrote the comics in a very poetic way. And they are each story has 8 pages. So one thing that I like to do before I start a book or a graphic novel is giving myself a few restrictions or a few, codes that I want to keep doing throughout the book. So I knew I wanted to have 8 pages for each woman, and I knew that each story would have 2 colors. So that's something that I usually think about before starting to write and draw, because for me it's easier and less daunting to have some kind of rule before I start writing and drawing. So those were the kind of codes and things that I thought before writing. And each story, besides being kind of like a letter to the future, it also had a little bio for each woman. And then by the end, in the book, there's a QR code, and you could go to a playlist. And I wrote a song for each woman. So I wanted to kind of like expand the limits of the book. And that's something that I'm very interested in, because I feel like as artists and, as storytellers, we sometimes convince ourselves that we are just one thing, and we keep going with that. Like, I'm an illustrator, and you can't really move from those limits. And I feel like for me, there's no difference between a poem, a graphic novel, a dance, a movie, or a song. I feel like we're all trying to express something. And as artists, I call myself an artist because I want to move freely through all these different mediums. And that's why I wanted to expand the limits of the book. And we made the songs with my partner, who's a musician, and other artists also sang the songs. And we recorded them, and you can go to the playlist when you finish reading the book. So I also made some animations for some of the songs. So I try to, use the same story and expand the book form. And then after I finished Women Move Mountains, I moved from Vermont to New York City. And that was the last day of 2019. So I moved in New Year's Eve, and obviously 2020, we all know what happened. And I found myself, January 1st, 2020, by myself inside an empty apartment in New York. And I couldn't stop crying. I was crying because, I don't know, I just felt like it was such a, I was moving physically, but it was very moved also emotionally. And because my reaction is always to draw and write in my sketchbook, I decided to write down my experience. So I started my crying diaries. So I started to write every time I cried and draw every time I cried. And it also became a Twitter thread. So I would start writing, today I cried because I saw a little dog with a sweater, or I would cry at the grocery store or at the movies. So I would do all these entries in my crying diaries. And suddenly, like 2 months in, the pandemic hit and we were all in lockdown. And I was crying more than ever. And I was crying every day because I couldn't go back home to Argentina because the borders were closed. And I was here in this new city and everything felt very, very extreme. So that's when I started researching why we cry. And because I was crying so much, I wanted to know, and I've always been a big crier, and I always try to hide my tears. So I really wanted to know at what point in evolution we connected emotions with tears. So I found out that we are the only species that cry because of emotions. Our emotional tears have different components than our physical tears. And I, found out that basically our crying evolved as a kind of signal because we are born very vulnerable and we are born less formed than other species. So we need connection. We need other people to survive. And that's our first, the reason for our first tears when we are babies. But that social connection grows with us. And as we get, into adulthood, maybe our reasons for crying evolve, but our social connection, our need for social connection is still there. So I found this very interesting, and I started thinking about a book that could actually connect my own crying experience, but also add all this research and, the science of crying, the history, how tears change throughout different moments in time, how our perception of tears change, why it became taboo to cry, and why we hide our tears. And I started asking myself all these questions, and I wanted to also see, how tears were portrayed in art, and why we cry with movies, why we cry with songs, and also the gender aspect of crying. So all of that research is in the book, and it's all intertwined with my own crying diaries. So I'm gonna read a little bit from the book, if that's okay. This is the cover of the book, and I have it here too. It's all illustrated, and it has a lot of color because as I said before, I give myself some restrictions. So I wanted my own crying diaries to be all in the same color palette. So more of a cream color and a blue color. So that's for my own experience. But then the research is all very colorful because when I started thinking about the tear, I feel like tears are kind of like crystals and like almost like prisms that can like expand all the colors like a rainbow. And at first I was like, I'm gonna do this book all blue, but then I was like, maybe it's not just blue because we can cry when we're happy, we can cry when we're feeling other things, other emotions. So I actually decided to do all the colors. Um, so yeah, that's the book and that's the cover. We can go to the other slide. Oh, that's me crying. And that's me drinking my tears. I recommend drinking your tears. No, just kidding. Actually, tears evaporate very easily because they have a lot of salt. So it's not possible to feel a cup of tears. I wish it could be possible, but it's not. Um, so yeah, I'm gonna start reading from the book. And it starts with this quote that I found, and I feel like it's when I first read it, I was like, this is the seed for this book. So it says, crying does not indicate that you're weak. Since birth, it has always been a sign that you are alive. Charlotte Bronte. When I feel like my brain is going to melt through my ears and through my eyes, I take a deep breath. I try to inhale every molecule of oxygen in the room. I cry a little, and my mind becomes crystal clear. Tears inside. I have always cried a lot. My mom says I cried steadily from the minute I was born until I turned 9 years old. I would cry at bumps, bruises, stressful situations, and misunderstandings. I cry all the time, and I used to feel self-conscious about it. For years, I wanted to control my crying. I would do anything to prevent tears from running down my face. I used to feel embarrassed and scared of being perceived as weak. Don't cry. A few years ago, I moved from Buenos Aires to New York City, and after hours and hours of crying inside my new empty apartment, I decided to start my crying diaries. I wrote down and drew every time I cried, and it helped me feel more connected to my tears. Research has found that in addition to being self-soothing, shedding emotional tears releases oxytocin and endorphins. These chemicals make you feel good. Crying may also ease anxiety. Tuesday, February 23rd, 2020. I woke up from a nap with tears in my eyes. In the past, crying my heart out helped me get through difficult and unpredictable times. Charles Darwin once declared emotional tears purposeless. Crying still remains largely taboo in society. Why is crying considered a bad thing? What does it mean if we cry, and why do we so often try to hide our tears? Crying is special. Humans are the only creatures whose tears can be triggered by their feelings. Crying here, crying there, crying everywhere. Crying is one of the most beautiful forms of bodily expression. We cry because we need other people, because we feel emotions deeply, because we are alive. Crying is completely normal. My wish for you tonight is that you laugh until you cry, and you cry until you laugh. Carl Sagan once said that humans are made of star stuff. Finding our place in the cosmos can be soul-stirring. Every time I look at the moon on a clear night, I am deeply moved and cry. Wednesday, September 2nd, 2020. I cried and fell asleep. Full moon in Pisces. Crying is the result of a fascinating chain reaction in the body. Human newborn babies do not have fully developed lacrimal glands and can't produce visible tears, but still frown and cry strongly to ask for love and assistance. Usually, babies start shedding really visible tears sometimes between 1 and 3 months of age. From birth, we cry because we need others. The crying wheel of fortune. You will cry at the grocery store. You will cry on the subway. You will cry at a party. You will cry in the shower. You will cry forever. You will cry in your dreams. You will cry artificial tears. You will cry on the phone. From the Greek catharsis, catharsis is an emotional release that provides renewal and restoration. Originally used by Aristotle in the Poetics, where he compared the effects of tragedy on the mind of a spectator to its effect on the body. In psychology, the term is associated with a Freudian psychoanalysis and is specifically related to the expression of buried trauma. When catharsis is successful, it brings trauma into consciousness, thus erasing it, which comes along with positive change. Cry, cry. Friday, May 14th, 2021. I cried during therapy. Classic. The summer the movie Titanic opened in theaters, I was 12 years old, and I had a big crush on Leonardo DiCaprio. I went to see it at the movie theater more than 7 times. Every time at the climax of the film, a big lump formed in my throat and the tear floodgates opened wide. My eyes became like 2 water fountains. I couldn't stop crying about Jack's death and the fact that I might never get to meet Leo DiCaprio in person. Years later, I saw Leonardo DiCaprio at the Electric Room in New York City, the night of my 27th birthday. I didn't cry. And now, if you want, for this part, you can close your eyes if you want and try and feel what I'm going to say, because this is practicing sense memory, which is bringing a feeling and emotion back. So if you want to close your eyes, I'm going to read and you have to do what I say. So close your eyes and visualize, see your parents' face in as much detail as possible. The outfit you wore to your first dance party. A starry summer sky from your childhood. Hear, listen, rain against the window, waves that come and go, the voice of your best friend. Smell, smoke from a bonfire, freshly baked bread. Taste, ice cream, buttery toast. Feel, a hot mug of tea in your hands, a feather tickling your cheeks. Did you cry on the inside? You can open your eyes. What do you feel when your loved ones cry? Crying has a purpose. Human tears have always been a part of evolution, helping us adapt to new realities. There's no point in holding them inside. Tears lubricate life, birth, and death. Crying is part of visible public acts of love and private expressions of pain. Monday, September 12th, 2022. I cried cleaning the oven and felt ready for the next stage of my life. Giving someone crying validation is essentially telling them that their reaction makes sense and that they can express emotion in a physical way. Humans are very diverse and react in different ways. So acknowledging other people's tears and feelings as valid is very healing for everyone, and it's a good practice for children and adults. If you find yourself inside a nebula, surrounded by cosmic dust, and you can't think right, remember, you are part of the Milky Way. You are here now. You don't need to hide in a molecular cloud. Your emotions, your tears in space, don't fall down. They become stars in the galaxy. Flower brain. Hey, there are flowers in the garden of your mind. You have planted your own memories. You can smell your thoughts, eat the velvety petals of your ideas, and water your brain with tears until it blooms. A tear is a universal sign and crying is evolution. Why is it normal to laugh together and cry alone? Crying brings out strong social bonding reactions, and people feel much more inclined to help those who are visibly producing tears. Understanding crying brings compassion and relief. You can transform your own feelings and help others by looking deeply into their crying. Sunday, October 24th, 2021. I cried looking for files on an external hard drive and thought about the people who store memories from my life. There's a magical place where tears meet laughter, and it feels like the ultimate human experience. Can you imagine the tears of the future? The end. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much for listening to my reading. And now we have the first writing prompt, and which I would love you to think about your first crying memory and describe it in detail. Where were you and how did you feel? If you don't remember your first time crying or a crying episode from long ago, you can do you can write about the last time you cried. But think about what you were feeling. And also, I like to say that tears are teachers, because even if we're, crying because of something silly or something that might be more physical or something that doesn't feel as important, there's a deeper meaning to our tears. So think about how you were feeling at the time and what was the reason for your crying, but also the secondary reason or the underlying reason for your crying. So we have 5 minutes to write, and if you want to share on the chat, I think you can do that. An image-based poem. So sometimes I start by writing scripts with words, and sometimes I start by drawing and then adding words that connect those drawings. And a lot of times in my sketchbook, I divide the page in 4, and I kind of write these poems or haikus with the images. So I would draw something that it's more of a close-up or something more related to science on the first panel. I would do, a middle shot or a close-up of a face, my face or someone's face, and then objects, and then more of a metaphorical and visual metaphor drawing. So what I like to do whenever I'm writing for an image or I'm drawing based on an image, is trying to see, you can describe what you're seeing. You can just, describe what you're seeing visually, but you can also add whatever you remember. For example, the first panel here is like, it feels like, an eye transitioning to a more open eye, or almost like the infinite symbol, and then the pupils widening. So you can, write something about what you remember about the science of the eyes. Then on the second sentence or the second panel, you can write more of a feeling or a more like an emotion. On the third panel, you can write, what you see or describe a game or an action, like something that is happening. And then on the last panel, more of like a conclusion, but also a more philosophical or a more descriptive, but in a like a sensory aspect. So yeah, I think you can just write 4 sentences, a short poem based on this image. And you don't have to do like every panel. You can just focus on one part of the image if you want. But try and, describe the image in your mind and then write whatever comes to you. And it can also be related to the colors and the textures. So yeah, if you want to start writing, you have 3 minutes. So we're gonna start doing that now.
Thank you everyone for joining tonight. And once again, Lata, if you could stay on with us, we'll grab your information for the giveaway. And thank you, Pepita.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone, and happy tears.